So it's Wednesday, 4 days before the release of the chapter of JJK. That means leaks are out. Right? No, you stupid idiot. Didn't you read the completely Japanese update from the Shonen Jump Twitter account? You didn't? You don't read Japanese? Figure it out. Because if you were able to read Japanese, you would have seen that the Shonen Jump Twitter account tweeted out that Gege's not feeling 100% yet. And while he is getting better, they want to make sure he's feeling 100% before he continues on with his manga. So while technically a new chapter of JJK was supposed to come out the 30th and therefore was supposed to leak today, Wednesday the 26th, that's not gonna happen. Which means we are now officially gonna go 1 full month without JJK, which is, it's fine. It has to be fine, but obviously it is fine. Gege can take as much time as he needs to get healthy before continuing with JJK. But the Lobotomy Kaizen community has never been given 4 weeks with their thoughts. And I'm starting to get a little concerned. But I'm not only concerned for them, I'm also concerned for me. 1, because I like talking about the JJK manga, and 2, because I don't usually get this much time with my thoughts. And while I took a very, very strategic vacation directly in the middle of the amount of time I was gonna have to go without JJK, while I was on that vacation, I was talking to somebody who saw my tattoos and went, "Oh my God, you're a weeb!" At which point I started talking to them about JJK, which they were keeping up with. And it's at this point that they brought a theory to my attention, one that I had never heard about. And the theory they brought to my attention was the idea that JJK is stuck in a time loop. And being the totally chill and regular human being I am, that caught me 100% off guard, and I immediately realized I have to have a sit-down conversation with this person. However, that person was on vacation with their family, and therefore, I didn't get to have a sit-down conversation with them. So, obviously, the first thing I did when I got home was feverishly look up this theory. And there's not a whole lot of information on it, and those who are theorizing about JJK being a time loop don't tend to agree with each other. And that's what makes it all the more impressive that A, this person knew about that theory, and B, knew enough to explain it to me at least even roughly. But as I do, I've now spent the entire morning feverishly trying to gather as much information on this theory as possible, which went so far as following and DMing the person who I believed had the best stance on this theory, that being somebody by the name of Suguro Gatos on TikTok. And thus, before we head into this video, I do have to give them a fair amount of credit. They popularized the idea that JJK is in some form of time loop, or a chiastic circle. So if you enjoy this theory, please don't give me credit for it. While I am going to expound on it in my own way, this was definitely not my idea. With all that said, as absolutely headcanon nonsense this idea sounds, there is a lot of evidence to back up the idea that JJK is in a plot loop. And while I'm going to try and make some predictions on my own here, Suguro Gatos already predicted with this model the awakening of Yuta's domain, Kenjaku's death, and Gojo's reawakening through the mind-swapping technique. So I'm now aligning myself with this model of thinking. And I think if you truly understand this model and see how it's able to predict the events in JJK, we can truly, once and for all, figure out how this story is going to end. Yes, I do genuinely believe that understanding the model of this theory will allow us to predict exactly how JJK will come to a close. And today I'm going to be helping you figure out that model. But before we get to figuring anything out, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me chatting about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talks Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, there's a lot to break down here, and there's 2 real ways to approach this theory. But before we get to approaching any of them, we need to differentiate how these 2 theories are fundamentally different. See, you've already heard me use a couple of different words, like time loop and chiastic circle. Now, while I'm sure the majority of you know what a time loop is, I'm also sure the majority of you probably don't know what a chiastic circle is. See, a chiasmus, or a chiastic structure, is a literary technique that, in the circumstance of what we're going to be talking about today, can be visualized as a circle, or I guess more of an oval. An oval would be more accurate. Now, chiastic structure, when used in literature, is essentially a form of writing where words used in the beginning of a paragraph are used in the reverse order in the end of a paragraph, kind of like a circle. It's often used in the Bible. So if the words A and then B were used in the first 2 sentences of scripture, then the words B and A would be used in the 3rd and 4th lines of scripture. That's a chiastic structure. But the important takeaway from all of this is that events that happen in the beginning happen in reverse order at the end, like a circle. So if you imagine half a circle with the entire alphabet along that half, A to Z, and then you make another half a circle that has the entire alphabet Z B to A, you could draw lines across that circle from A to A, B to B, and so on and so forth. And that would be a chiastic circle writing technique, where events that happen chronologically in the beginning of the story are reflected upon chronologically the end of the story. Now, while this technically could be called a time loop, it's not really that. See, a time loop, at least in the context of what we're going to be talking about today, refers to roles that exist in different generations, or tropes that continue reoccurring in new generations. A good example of the time loop example that we're going to be talking about eventually is Maki and Toji, the role of the heavenly restricted character. And this is the key differences between the two kinds of theories we're going to be talking about. One's a chiastic circle, one's a time loop. So let's talk about the time loop theory first, because it's inherently simpler. But once you understand how the time loop theory works and the connections that have been made between the beginning and the end of the story and the roles individual characters have reoccurringly played, that theory can be parlayed into the chiastic circle model. See, the way that this theory was presented to me, and basically all I got out of my conversation with that person in Mexico, was that they didn't believe that JJK was a time loop theory, to which they responded by saying, well, yeah, Kenjaku's kind of back through the medium of Yuta, and Sukuna is once again standing atop the world as the king of curses, which is very similar to what happened in the Heian era 1,000 years ago, and that there's a possibility that after Sukuna is victorious against all the sorcerers in Japan, he will once again split his body into 20 fingers and wait another 1,000 years. But since that was all the information I got on the time loop theory, I had to do some of my own individual digging, which led me to the prognosis that if JJK does exist in the time loop, Kenjaku is the only person who exists outside of that loop. That is to say that Kenjaku, in a sense, is walking through time, which makes sense when you think about it because Kenjaku has existed for 1,000 years. Kenjaku didn't remanifest like the sorcerers in the Culling games. Kenjaku is the reason those sorcerers remanifested, and thus Kenjaku exists outside of the bounds of time. In fact, one could even make the argument that Kenjaku is the reason JJK is stuck in a time loop, because Kenjaku was the person who taught Sukuna how to split his soul into 20 fingers, and Kenjaku was the person who provided Sukuna with all of the world's most powerful sorcerers so that they could relive the Heian era. And thus one can make the argument that Yuta taking over Kenjaku's body swapping ability is him and Sukuna restarting the time loop. But the time loop is actually much smaller than a 1,000 year period. See, because throughout the entirety of JJK's storyline, we've seen multiple tropes and multiple very similar events play out over time. The most notable of these events is something that people talk about almost endlessly, but have never really found out why it was pointed out to us in the manga. And that was the conversation between Gojo and Megumi, where Gojo pointed out to Megumi that a couple hundred years ago, a 10 Shadows user killed a user of the Limitless in the Six Eyes. And for a long time, while this factoid didn't seem necessarily all that important, with Sukuna taking over Megumi's body and then using the power of the 10 Shadows to cut down Gojo, a user of the Limitless in the Six Eyes, this appears to be a moment in history repeating itself. And in that moment, Gojo and Megumi/Sukuna are reliving the role of their ancestors. However, when talking about time loops in JJK, they most heavily revolve around Yuta and Yuji, our two protagonists. Because think about what was recently revealed about Yuji's role on Earth. Apparently, in every single generation, there is a reincarnation of Sukuna's consumed twin brother. And Yuji is the son of that reincarnation and Kenjaku. This reincarnation cycle, of which Yuji is a direct descendant of, speaks to the repeatability of the JJK universe. However, that's not Yuji's only tie to this time loop, because over the course of the last 30 or 40 chapters, it's honestly felt like, Yuji has been stuck in what we've referred to rather lovingly as the Sukuna cycle, a cycle in the manga after Gojo's death at the hands of Sukuna, where Yuji and somebody else go into combat against Sukuna just to have that other person who isn't Yuji eventually get cut down. This has happened 4, maybe 5 times to Yuji, as Yuji and Higuruma were technically the second and third people to jump into the battle against Sukuna after Gojo was cut in half, and while at times their battle looked promising, slowly but surely Sukuna got the upper hand, and this led to Higuruma's eventual demise. And every single time that somebody beside Yuji gets cut down, somebody new enters the equation, and thus is referred to as the Sukuna cycle. New opponents show up, they get the upper hand on Sukuna, Sukuna makes a binding vow, somebody not named Yuji dies. At first it was Higuruma, and then then it was Kusakabe, and then it was Yuta, and then it was Miguel and LaRue, and then it was Chozo, and then it was Maki. Over and over and over again, it appears as though Yuji and the additional fighter get an upper hand on Sukuna just for Sukuna to eventually take out the additional fighter. And thus the Sukuna cycle is in essence a time loop for Yuji. And what's interesting about this is that we've seen actual time loops in JJK, specifically in the beginning of the Hidden Inventory arc, when Utahime is stuck battling against a cursed spirit that forces her into a time loop, and every single time they're about to get out, they get sent back to the beginning. Now, rather interestingly, Hidden Inventory is technically the beginning of the chronological order of everything that happens in JJK. It is technically the beginning of the story. However, Utahime isn't stuck in this time loop forever, because Gojo and Geto show up on the scene, and Gojo blows away the cursed spirit, getting rid of the time loop. Now, rather interestingly, Gojo has just re-entered the fray through the medium of Gota. Yujo. I don't know, what is the community agreed on? And thus there's a fair amount of credence to the theory that Gota is going to be able to break Yuji out of the Sukuna cycle, operating in the same capacity as Gojo did for Utahime in the beginning of the story. But that technically plays more into our chiastic circle theory than our time loop theory. What does play into our time loop theory, however, is the presence of Todo on the battlefield currently, as Todo has now thrice come to Yuji at his lowest moment and used his boogie woogie technique to allow him and Yuji to overcome a much greater foe, speaking to the possibility of Todo filling a role in Yuji's life where he appears in his moment of greatest lows. And thus the core backbone of this theory is, whether or not you believe in time loops, it's very hard to ignore the fact that the events of JJK are very circular, and therefore it's believed that the combination of the abilities of the Time Walker himself, Kenjaku, and the body of Gojo, who was able to break Utahime out of the time loop in the chronological beginning of this story, that Gota will finally be able to break the time loop that Yuji has been stuck in. And there's more evidence to corroborate the idea that this time loop has existed all along. See, Geto in Chapter 0 recruits Miguel to stall Gojo long enough that Yuta will finally fall into his nimbly little fingers. That is to say that Gojo giving Miguel the beatdown of a lifetime was technically set up by Geto so that Geto could defeat Yuta and acquire Rika. And with the reemergence of Miguel back into the manga in a very similar circumstance, that is Miguel battling it out against the King of Curses while Yuta once again battles Geto's body in the form of Kenjaku, speaks to the cyclical nature of Miguel's role. On top of this, just the sheer fact that Yuta was the person who not only cut down Geto but also Kenjaku is why I said that this time loop seems to most heavily revolve around Yuji and Yuta. In fact, the analysis of this moment and Yuta's cyclical nature is what allowed Suguro Getos to realize that Yuta was going to have another true love moment with Rika. See, because Yuta uses his love beam in the battle against Geto to completely erase his maximum Uzumaki, which then leads to Geto's subsequent demise. And this moment draws a direct parallel to Yuta opening his domain expansion in his battle against Sukuna, which is called True Mutual Love. But Yuji and Yuta aren't the only people involved in this time loop. Like I already said at the beginning of this video, arguably the best example of this time loop where people are fulfilling a role in different generations is Maki and Toji, as Maki and Toji's roles are not only very similar, but also their abilities are also very similar. See, Maki achieves Heavenly Restriction and immediately eradicates the Zenin clan. Now, this is obviously very similar to Toji, who was shunned out of the Zenin clan because of his lack of Jujutsu ability, and thus he eradicated the Zenin clan from himself, adopting his wife's name, Fushiguro. That is to say that both Maki and Toji not only achieved full Heavenly Restriction, but also eradicated their connection to the Zenin clan. And that's not the only similarity between the two of them, as the key similarity in their role is that they both backstab their incredibly powerful opponent the second they put their guard down. That is to say that their biggest time loop moment is when Gojo gets stabbed through the chest by Toji the second they get to Jujutsu High, and Maki stabbing Sukuna through the heart the second Yuta's domain shatters. Both moments of which they were able to achieve because of their Heavenly Restriction. Tie this into the fact that Gojo and Geto die on the same day, a year apart. Mechamaru makes a binding vow that leads to him betraying the Jujutsu Society just to use that binding vow to battle against Kenjaku, which is exactly what Yuta does in the beginning of the Yuji extermination arc, and what Miwa does when she swings her sword at Kenjaku. In all three of these scenarios, a binding vow was made so they could take Kenjaku out. And while Miwa's inclusion here is a bit of a stretch, I'll admit, it's not a stretch to say that both Yuta and Mechamaru made binding vows that were technically traitorous to the Jujutsu Society, all for what they thought was the betterment of said society. But now that you understand all of these connections and how how the events of JJK are incredibly circular, let's take the explanation of this theory one step further, to the chiastic circle structure. See, the difference between these two is that while a time loop can talk about individual events, chiastic circle structure plots all of these events on one timeline. See, well, the time loop theory would look kind of like this, with Yuji and Yuta having people around them going through time loop roles. The chiastic circle structure would plot the entirety of JJK's chronological timeline around an oval, with the beginning of JJK's chronological story being right here and the ending being right here. And the craziest thing about these two theories is that if you plot all of these individual time loop events on this circle, it's all straight lines. But what do I mean by that? Well, if we take the chronological story of JJK and put it on a circle, that means that the ending of JJK should mirror the beginning of JJK, meaning the end of JJK should look like the beginning of the hidden inventory arc. And it kind of already does. See, from the top of our head, what is the hidden inventory arc about? The merger, right? Specifically Tengen trying to merge with Rico Amanai, the star plasma vessel, and Gojo and Geto, as the two strongest students that Jujutsu High has to send, are trying to get Rico to Tengen so that she can initiate the merger, which would stop Tengen from being able to merge with everybody and anybody. However, because of Toji's interference, the merger can't happen. He kills Rico. However, technically, the beauty of that situation is that the merger wouldn't have happened even if Toji didn't kill Rico. In fact, it was Geto's interference that would have stopped the merger without Toji, meaning that Geto in a sense had an active hand in making Tengen the way that it currently is. Kind of like how Kenjaku was in charge of initiating the merger after the Culling Games, of which he passed on to Megumi, Toji's son, who now has the ability to influence the merger more than anybody else on Earth. Kind of like how his father influenced the lack of the merger in the chronological beginning of this story. But that's not all. Maki stabbing Sukuna through the heart the second that Yuta's domain crumbled happened pretty recently, right? So that could be argued to be towards the end of the story, but it's not the end of the story. There's still a fair amount of JJK left, which is why drawing a parallel between that moment and Toji stabbing Gojo through the heart, which chronologically happens about halfway through the hidden inventory arc, is so wildly accurate if you're plotting it on a circle. Not to mention, Maki also sustained a serious stomach wound from the person she stabbed through the heart. And while Toji's stomach wound was a bit more serious, I mean, a hollow purple will do that to you, Maki is currently down for the count after receiving a black flash from Sukuna to the stomach. But if you want to look more towards the center of the story to try and corroborate whether or not these plot lines are truly drawing straight lines, Yuta consuming a finger before his battle against Sukuna is supposed to draw a parallel to the beginning of JJK when Yuji consumed a finger. And since this happened right before Yuta's death, let's call it, this technically draws a line perfectly to when Yuta was supposed to give his life to Rika at the end of Chapter 0. And chronologically, as close as you can get in terms of events would be the end of Chapter 0 and the beginning of JJK. So chronologically, the events went, Rika was supposed to take Yuta's soul, so death, and then Yuji ate a finger. And on the other side of the circle, Yuta ate a finger and then died. A perfect line between the two of them, death and the consumption of one of Sukuna's fingers. Specifically, the consumption of the first of Sukuna's fingers. Which means now, with Yuta controlling Gojo's body, the story should reflect, in reverse, the events of the hidden inventory arc. Which means we can theorize a couple of things will happen. Kenjaku's power, or Maki, will be essential in the stopping of the merger, in order to reflect the events of Geto and Toji working together to stop Rico from merging with Tengen. But that happens at the end of the hidden inventory arc, which means it would happen relatively early on in the ending of JJK. As if we were doing a full chiastic circle, technically the ending of JJK should reflect the beginning of the hidden inventory arc, which means the story should actually end with Gojo in some capacity breaking the time loop, because the beginning of the hidden inventory arc is Gojo breaking the time loop curse spirit to free Utahime. Now, if Gojo was to break this time loop, which is heavily focused on the concept of reincarnation, it should technically end with him being with Geto, because he was with Geto when he destroyed the time loop curse spirit. Now, ironically, before Gojo was actually able to destroy this time loop, though, he should have a conversation with Geto in some capacity about their ideologies. Because for those of you who don't remember hidden inventory number 1, immediately after they destroy the time loop curse spirit, Gojo and Geto have their famous conversation while playing basketball, where Geto is talking about how it's their duty as sorcerers to to protect the weak, while Gojo was saying that we shouldn't have to worry about them. Now, obviously, it was the switch in this ideology that eventually led to Geto realizing he needed to free the world of cursed energy, but since I believe that the ending of JJK will most likely bring about the ending of cursed energy, because so long as cursed energy exists, this cyclical nature of violence and cursed spirits will continue, this conversation will once again proceed with Geto technically being correct. See, because moralistically, the conversation that Gojo and Geto have while playing basketball, Geto is morally correct. Geto states that it's the duty of the strong to protect the weak. And while a series of traumatizing events will slowly but surely chip away this ideology from Geto, in the context of that conversation, Geto is morally correct. At least that's what most people would say. However, if for some reason, like the merger half happening, eliminates cursed energy from Japan, if Gojo and Geto were to have another conversation, technically Geto would once again be in the right, as Geto's plan was to get rid of cursed energy in Japan. And it would be Gojo who facilitated that by destroying the time loop, much in the same capacity as how Gojo had to live up to Geto's ideals after Geto died and turned to the darkness. Now that only leaves us with one question: in what capacity will Gojo and Geto be reunited? Well, I believe Yuta's kind of in a unique situation currently. See, it's already been established that Geto was able to battle back against Kenjaku's possession in the Shibuya incident, and how the specifics of the brain swapping technique works has actually been a huge talking point recently in the manga, with everybody trying to guesstimate how the technique works because they don't know if after 5 minutes Yuta's body's gonna drop cold. And thus the biggest talking point is whether or not the brain swapping technique is a continuous type curse technique or a single time usage one. And thus I believe when those 5 minutes are up, there's a somewhat solid possibility that Gojo's corpse could become a cursed corpse. Because think about it, we already know that there's two souls residing inside of Gojo's body: Gojo and Yuta. And while there's technically no concrete way for us to say that Gojo's soul is still in there, if Geto was able to battle back against Kenjaku after having his body taken over, I'd reckon there's at least a part of Gojo left in there. Now that's one soul short of what we would need for a cursed corpse, because Principal Yaga very pointlessly pointed out to us that to create a cursed corpse, you need 3 spirits living all inside of one body. And while sure you could make the argument that that explanation was given to us so we could understand how Panda was created, why do we care how Panda was created? It seemed, and still does seem, rather obvious that the Principal Yaga Cursed Corpse exposition dump was hinting at the possibility of a cursed corpse playing a large role down the line, especially when you consider the fact the verbiage that Principal Yaga talked about cursed corpse with, where he stated that all 3 souls are needed to keep each other in check, implying that the 3 souls operate as an id, an ego, and a super ego. And thus it is technically a possibility, considering the fact that Rika consumed Kenjaku, who was just Geto, mind you, so that some semblance of Geto or Kenjaku's soul still exists inside of Yuta. And thus there is technically a possibility that Gojo's body could continue living as a cursed corpse with Gojo, Geto, and Yuta's souls. However, it does seem substantially more likely to me at least that that split would actually be Gojo, Yuta, and Sukuna, because Yuta very obviously ate one of Sukuna's fingers. However, this reunion obviously also doesn't have to happen on Earth. This reunion could very easily happen in the afterlife, as we've already got a glimpse into Gojo entering the afterlife anyways. And thus possibly after Yuta's defeat, Gojo and Geto in the afterlife could rehash their conversation about whether or not he was Gojo because he was the strongest or the strongest because he was Gojo. And thus I do genuinely believe, whether or not Gege is actually doing it on purpose, that if you want to try and predict the events of how JJK is going to end, you have to look at its beginning, specifically in reverse, because that's where the true hints might lie. And if you guys feel as though I didn't do a good enough job explaining any of these possible theories, please do look at the top pinned video on Suguro Geito's TikTok page. They do a really good job breaking down the chiastic circle structure and basically everything else revolving around this theory. And while I definitely put a lot of Nickisms into this theory and made it my own in a certain capacity, once again, I'd like to thank them for the idea. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you think this is 3 weeks of lobotomy Kaizen stewing in my brain, or do you think this theory might actually make sense? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I'm going to VidCon.